Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Welcome to the weekly Top 3, the top 3 things on our mind here at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets for the week of February 23rd, 2026. The weekly Top 3 is a regular segment on The Michael Dukes Show. The show broadcasts on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, as well as via streaming audio from the show's website, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. I join Michael weekly in the first hour of Tuesday's show from 6:10 to 7 a.m. for a discussion between the two of us about our 3 issues. We post the podcast of our discussion following the show on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, also on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets website, as well as the project's page on national blog site, medium.com. You can find past episodes of the weekly Top 3 also at the same locations. Keep in mind that in addition to these podcasts, during the week, you can also follow and participate in the discussion with us of these and other issues affecting Alaska's fiscal and economic condition by following us on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook page and through our posts on Twitter. This week, our top 3 issues are these. First, we discussed the action taken by Senate Resources this past week on oil taxes and why we think it's unserious. Second, we explain how Representative Galvin's proposed income tax becomes very regressive, indeed much more than the governor's proposed sales tax, when coupled with the additional steps required to close the full deficit. And third, we explore why some seem to discard alternatives to PFD cuts, even though, by raising substantial amounts from non-Alaskans, using the alternatives would leave much more money in the pockets of Alaska's families and the Alaska economy. And now, let's join Michael.
Brad, let's get down to it because, boy, I'll tell you what, the stuff that's going on down in Juneau is just, man, it's making my head spin. All the mental gymnastics that are required for some of the behavior down in Juneau right now is pretty crazy. Let's start off with the Senate Resources Committee and this massive overreach where, and on the one hand, they saw the governor's revenue bill and they were like dead on arrival. But let's take this part of it and let's stretch this out into infinity. Give me the deets here.
Yeah. So there's no question that oil taxes need to be adjusted, need to be changed, need to be reformed. Absolutely no question about that. When you look forward for the next 10 years, the production tax, which traditionally, at least over the first decade of SB 21, produced about 7% of gross oil revenues, gross wellhead oil revenues, produced about 7% take for the state. When you look over, when you compare that to the upcoming decade and look at the projection that Department of Revenue has made, that's down to less than 2% by the end of the 10-year period, and that's horribly deficient against any standard, judging it against other states, judging it against what oil companies can stand, judging it against where Alaska was during the first decade of ACES or first decade of SB 21, judging it against where Alaska was before ACES, before the overreach of ACES. No question that oil taxes need to be reformed. And the legislature needs to dig in and do the hard work to do that. What Senate Resources did instead, by substituting in a 17% gross production tax in place of the governor's proposed fairly carefully thought out revenue plan, by substituting in 17%, is a horrible overreach. I mean, it would that at that level, gross production taxes would exceed gross production taxes in any other state in the U.S. and added to royalty and added to the other taxes that we have, property taxes, corporate income tax, and royalties. It would produce a level of take that's substantially higher than what you find in most other countries. So the 17% is as much a foolish proposal as the current SB 21 regime that's producing less than 2% by the end of the 10-year period. It is as much an overreach as the current oil tax regime is an underreach. I don't know what Senate Resources was trying to do. I don't know what Giesel and Wielechowski were trying to do. In some sense, it's counterproductive. If they were truly trying to reform oil taxes, it was counterproductive in the sense that it's like a poison pill. I mean, nobody should adopt, and hopefully nobody will adopt a 17% gross production tax. And so by putting that out there as their proposed solution, they essentially put out something that wouldn't and shouldn't be adopted, and essentially made it into a poison pill that nobody will touch. They could have done the hard work. I mean, modeling this stuff is not all that difficult. I've done it in some of the columns. I've done most of it in some of the columns I've written in the Alaska landmine. You can look at levels of take in the last decade of SB 21, which is a good standard to start with. You can look at the level of take in the last decade or the first decade of SB 21, and see what you have to do, see what adjustments you have to make in the oil tax code going forward to match that level of take that you had in the first level. If you want to go back to what we had before ACES in the old system, the old gross production tax system we had before ACES, you can model that. You can see how you need to adjust production taxes to go back to that level. So it's not all that hard to do. And the fact that they didn't do it, and the fact that they overreached by going to 17% is a real disappointment. And frankly, some indication that I don't think they're serious about looking at the changes necessary to gross production taxes.
How much of this do you think is just the grinding axe that Wielechowski has? I mean, he's been very much so. I mean, he's the guy that's been quoted as saying we're underselling our own take by $1 billion. He's constantly been hammering on this for years. And while you and I both agree that there is money on the table, there's got to be a balance there, right, to manage investment and everything else.
Yeah, exactly right, Michael. I mean, what we had under ACES, you can look at what we had under ACES by looking at the tax levels and looking at the resulting impact on producer economics, and then looking at the investment levels. We had, while the world from roughly 2010 up to 2014, while the world was having a huge jump in investment in oil projects worldwide, Alaska was going down in terms of investment. And you can tie that directly to the economics that ACES created. So we needed an adjustment in 2014. Now, that adjustment, I think, was good and was solid for the first decade of SB 21. It resulted in a take of about 7% of gross production and gross revenues. And that's a fairly standard level. If you look at the severance tax levels that are on the gross throughout the U.S. and throughout the world, 7% is a pretty standard number. And so we were roughly following along with that number in the first decade. But in the second decade of SB 21, because of the way all of the credits and all of the deductions start piling on top of each other in the environment as we've gone into the second decade, we're plunging. Oil production taxes are plunging. And Wielechowski's right to raise that issue, and he's right to focus on that issue. But he's gone way too far. It's like he's not serious about it. It's like he wants to do, messaging about, oh, we need to change it. We need to change it in a dramatic way, without being serious in trying to change it in a way that's productive. I mean, he talks about Hammond. He talked about, getting back to the Hammond standard. Well, there's a couple of things that's wrong with his view of adding 17.5 to 12.5 to get the 12.5 royalty to get to 30%. One, Hammond's third was on the net. It wasn't on the gross. And so when you try to get to a third on the gross, you're way overreaching on the net. Net is after costs. And the other thing is he ignores the impact. Alaska collects revenues from producers in 4 different ways. We do it through royalties, through the production tax, through the corporate income tax, which has its own problems that need to be dealt with. But we still collect some revenues through corporate income tax and through statewide property tax and oil property tax. And those 4 add up to a certain level of revenue. When you try to get to the Hammond's third, misstating the third as being on the gross, when you try to get to the Hammond's third by just using two of those and ignore the other two, you're way overreaching. So Bill just comes across as unserious at a time when we need serious tax reform, at a time when we do need tax reform. And there are ways to do that tax reform in a way that would produce good numbers, solid numbers, both for the state and for the producers. And there's ways to go about it. And, there's a fairly clear path to how you get there, to the reforms you need to make. At a time when we need that serious tax reform, Bill's being unserious about it. And Giesel joined in, and Clayman and others that voted for that bill out of Senate resources. Shoving it off on Senate Finance at a time when Senate Finance has a whole lot of other things to do is also unserious. I mean, Senate resources is the place where oil tax reform is always started. It started either in resources on the House side or resources on the Senate side. And they've done the hard work of going in, getting the testimony, developing the numbers, looking at the projections, and putting together a fairly solid case of how you do oil tax reform. For them to just, to go to that number and then just throw it off to Senate Finance is unserious. Is an unserious way of legislating at a time that we need serious legislating.
So what's your speculation here as to why it's gone down like this? Because again, this was very rushed. I mean, usually these things take a long time to pencil out because the tax structures are pretty complex and everything else. And I mean, they banged this thing out in an afternoon kind of thing. You know what I mean? It was like pretty quick. So is this all political theater? Is this performative just for him to be able to beat his chest on election season and say, look, I tried to tax the oil companies? Or is what do you think? Are they trying to just start the conversation? Because I would have thought that if they were going to start the conversation, they would have done it in the committee and held it in the committee and made a lot more hay about it.
The takeaway I have from it is that Wielkowski's counted the votes, and this could be wrong, but the takeaway I have is that Wielkowski's counted the votes aren't there for reform. And so what he's done instead was decide to go for headlines, decide to, go for this exaggerated number, try to tie himself to Hammond in the wrong way. And try to, grab headlines about he's a crusader, and use the situation to his own personal political advantage instead of trying to be serious about it. And that would be consistent with the thought process that I'm not going to get the votes anyway. I'm not going to get reform anyway. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, grab headlines, and I'm going to, go on the attack and try to, make hay out of this, because I'm not going to be able to get reform anyway. It's not good legislating. I mean, even if you didn't think you were going to get it through this year, right? This process takes a long time to sort of grind through the numbers, grind through the testimony, put together a thoughtful package. And unlikely to pass in the first session where you're doing that, but it lays the groundwork for subsequent sessions that you've sort of come in then with all that stuff done. You can really start, trying to put the votes together. And he's foregone, the committee has foregone that opportunity in this situation. Just sort of, thrown their hands up the air and said, give me some headlines and move on.
Political theater at its finest. So what is the solution here, Brad? If the number's not 17, or there's other components to it that should be brought into play, in a perfect world where Brad Keithley was emperor for a day, what would this look like? What would we be talking about?
They had a couple of pieces right in the committee hearing, I think before the one where they came up with 17. One was to harden the floor. One of the problems that we've got in the current oil tax structure is we've got a so-called 4% minimum, 4% of the gross minimum on the oil tax. And that's supposed to sort of act as a floor on how far oil production taxes can drop due to as a result of the other provisions of SB 21. The problem with that floor is it doesn't always apply. And so, as we've talked about on previous shows, there is one category of production, new production, that qualifies for what's called the gross value reduction, GVR provisions of SB 21. And that grows, those volumes grow from 3% to like 50%, over 50% by the end of the 10-year period, volumes that qualify for GVR. And GVR has a credit provision to it that goes below the floor. The floor doesn't apply to it. And so that's what's driving down the production tax levels down to, less than 2% over the 10-year period.
Right.
They talked about hardening the floor and not allowing the GVR credits to go below the floor, and also resetting the floor at 6%. Both of those would be significant fail safes in SB 21. If the rest of SB 21 is doing weird things, those floors would do a lot to make sure that the state continues to get its fair share of the gross wellhead revenue provisions. So they were close when they were talking about those, and then they just threw those out the window and went to the 17% of gross approach. So they had elements. It looked like to me like they had elements that they could start piecing together a good reform package, and then they didn't.
So the GVR and the floor is the problem. That's why we have more production but less revenue coming in, less taxes coming in, because the GVR and the floor are not working together in the way that they should.
Yeah.
Where if those were fixed, then we'd have more production, and more production would lead inevitably to more tax revenue.
Yeah, I did a column a few weeks back that looked at what if we had a 6% or a 6.75%, which is what we averaged during the first decade of SB 21, 6.75% of gross. What if we had a floor at that level, and the increase in production tax revenues would be at about the $400 to $500 to $600 million level that we've always talked about, that we're running deficient right now. So that's about right. That's about the right way to approach it. Let SB 21 do whatever the heck it's doing with all the other provisions, but harden that floor and set the floor at a rate, at a level that is reflective of what happens in other states and reflective of what happened during the first decade of SB 21. Those simple steps would do a lot to fix the problems we're having with oil production taxes.
Okay, we're continuing now. Brad Keithley from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Again, ak4sb.com. That's where you find him. Continuing on for the weekly top three. We just finished up with number one. Number two, exactly how regressive is the income taxes we've been talking about here, because there's all kinds of different tax revenue measures and everything else, but one of them is the quote unquote income tax that's focused, Brad says, on locking in a long-term PFD cut. Brad?
Well, this is sort of the continuation of we're not having serious legislation this session, or we're having performative arts this session. Elise Galvin has a bill that has stirred up a lot of people. It is a proposed education tax, what she calls an education tax. But since you can't dedicate funds, a tax to raise money for education, she says. But since you can't dedicate funds, it's not really that. It's to raise revenue that might be used for K through 12, but might be used for other things as well. And it's just stirred up all sorts of reactions, both from the conservative side and from the progressive side. The progressives say, yeah, it's about time we had that income tax. Conservatives, claiming it's the end of the world to have a progressive income tax. What's really interesting about it is it's not serious. I mean, so we have about a $1.5 billion deficit under current law. When you count the PFD at current law, we have about a $1.5 billion deficit over the next 10 years. Some weeks it's higher than that. The projection is higher than that. Some weeks it's lower, depending upon where oil prices are going. But let's just say it's a $1.5 billion deficit. Elise Galvin's bill raises $330 million, about 20%, about a fifth of the size of the deficit. it's gotten all this reaction that people think, oh, it's going to raise all of this money. It's going to wipe out the deficit. We're going to, solve it in a way that progressives like. It doesn't do that. Raises about a 20th, about 20% of the overall deficit over the next 10 years. So what does she think is going to close the rest of the deficit? PFD cuts. So this revenue that she's proposing to raise is 20% coming from this progressive income tax. The other 80% of it is coming from PFD cuts, additional continuing PFD cuts. And the bill's designed in a way to lock in those PFD cuts, because once you've spent all this energy and you spent all this legislative angst to go through and enact a progressive tax, you're not going to go in and enact another tax. Everybody's going to say, top 20% included, everybody's going to say, we've had our tax.
Right.
Now the rest of it has to come from someplace else. And the rest of it in the design of what she's talked about, the rest of it comes from PFD cuts. So overall, this so-called progressive income tax is hugely regressive, because you've got to combine the effect of the little bit of progressive income tax at the front end with the huge amount of continued PFD cuts, highly regressive PFD cuts at the back end to make the damn thing balance. And the net result is even more regressive. The net result of those two things is even more regressive than the governor's proposed sales tax, which everybody claims is hugely regressive and a bad thing. So the net result of this progressive income tax that Elise Galvin's talked about and other people have jumped on board with is to produce a total fiscal package, including the back end PFD cuts that you have to have added to it, is to produce a solution that is more regressive than the governor's approach. Not quite as regressive as doing it all through PFD cuts,
right?
But the 20% coming from the income tax isn't nearly enough to shave down the regressivity in a way that approaches what's going on with sales taxes. So it's performance. It's not an attempt to seriously resolve Alaska's overall budget situation. It's not an attempt to really be fair to middle and lower income Alaska families, although she claims it, because the proposed tax doesn't kick in until 150,000 single taxpayer, 300,000 two taxpayer, doesn't kick in until the high levels. She claims it's a burden. She's trying to shift the burden to higher income taxpayers. But when you look at the overall effect of the little that's being raised through the income tax portion, and then the remainder that has to be raised through additional PFD cuts, it is shifting the burden, permanently shifting the burden to middle and lower income Alaska families.
As you look at this, and again, it seems like what these legislators are favoring more and more are these super convoluted ways of doing things. I mean, we look at Kathy Giesel, the education bill that Zach Fields and Elise Galvin and Andrew Gray, the head tax up to a certain amount, beyond underneath a certain amount. If you make over this much money, then you spend. If you make over this much money, then you got to spend another additional $2,000. Now, Elise Galvin's got her own progressive income tax, and instead of just a flat sales tax or a flat tax, one of the two, why do we have to make it so convoluted? Unless, as you said, it's a backdoor way of kind of semi-codifying these cuts, because once they've done all the pain and got, like you said, they won't increase it. There won't be any more talk about taxes because, hey, we just had a tax thing last year. We'll just keep taking the PFD.
Yeah, it's a hide the ball trick. I mean, in a way, it's to claim one thing, to claim that you're being progressive, to claim that you're going to tag high income Alaska families as bearing the burden of this, when in fact you're really shifting the burden to middle and lower income Alaska families. They're trying to say, we're progressive. We're not like that bad governor who wants a sales tax, who wants a regressive sales tax. We're progressives. We want this. We want an income tax that is, focused on high income families. Trying to hide the ball of that. What they're really doing is by combining that with PFD cuts, which they have to do to close the deficit. By combining with PFD cuts, they're resulting in a worse overall impact on Alaska families and the Alaska economy than the governor's proposed straightforward sales tax. There are different ways to do the governor's sales tax that make it a little bit better or a little bit worse. There's different ways to do a flat income tax that ICER recently analyzed. There's different ways to do that to make it a little bit better or a little bit worse. And you can focus on those to solve the overall problem. But what a Galvin's doing is trying to, again, like Wielechowski, trying to grab headlines by saying, look, I'm a progressive. I'm going to, have this this income tax applicable only to high income Alaska families. I'm a progressive, when in fact, she's not doing anything. I mean, she's hurting middle and lower income Alaska families more than the governor's bad sales tax proposes to do.
Well, and there's so much hypocrisy going on in here, even in this article talking about the new revenue that we were just talking about in the last segment. Their justification for taking the sales tax from the bill dismissed the idea due to what they said was overwhelming opposition to a revenue measure that would disproportionately affect lower income Alaskans. And again, they just sat through an ICER report that said what? Taking the PFD has the largest adverse impact on the Alaska economy and Alaska families, specifically those in the lower income. I mean, there's just so much. Again, I'm agreeing with you that this is, again, more about performative, not serious people just looking to grab headlines to get them through the next elections. This is what Rob Myers has been talking about, how the structures are in place and the incentives are in place for them to do nothing but just run to the next election cycle. That's what this is about.
Yeah, and Galvin, I mean, so the press is falling for it hook, line, and sinker too. That piece you just read about, the regressivity of the governor's sales tax, certainly not as regressive as PFD cuts, and not as regressive even once you put the two pieces together. Not as regressive even as Elise Galvin's proposed bill, because of the back end piece of PFD cuts that you have to use to close the remainder of the deficit. Not as regressive, certainly not as the governor's proposed sales tax is certainly not as regressive as the combination of the education head tax that Giesel's talked about, and the back end of having to use PFD cuts to raise the remainder of it. They're getting people to focus on sort of this veneer, if I can use that phrase, this veneer of progressivity, like Elise Galvin's bill, or Giesel's less regressive than the governor's proposed. They're getting people to focus on this veneer without looking beyond the veneer and saying, wait, that only raises $300 million. We've got a $1.5 million deficit. How the hell is she going to raise the other 1.2 without asking that question? Right. And then applying that remaining 1.2 to the 300 million and seeing what the regressivity is of that.
Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Final thoughts on number 2, Brad?
Well, it's a continuation. This may be the theme today. It's a continuation of performative legislating as opposed to solid, serious legislating. They're trying to make headlines with these claims. Wielechowski, in the case of the 17% gross production tax, and Elise Galvin with the claim of, I'm only going to focus on higher income Alaska families. They're trying to it's performative in the sense they're trying to grab headlines, but it's not serious in the sense that they're trying to actually solve problems.
Virtue signaling, kabuki theater, performative, whatever you want to call it. It's to grab headlines and give them something to point back to when the election season kicks off here right after this session's over. Barbara says, our resident economist, every tax in the end is regressive. The rich can always maneuver their life to escape taxes. The poor can always lobby. The working middle class ultimately bears the burden one way or the other. I had a surprise visit yesterday from Jonathan Christ Tompkins. He showed up here at the studio, and we had a brief discussion. And this is one of the things that we talked about, was that what's going on in the legislature right now, the behavior, the disconnect from the private economy and everything else, is showing exactly this, right, Brad? On the one side, you've got the poor who are dependent on the social safety net, the welfare net. On the other side, you've got the rich and the crony capitalists who are building their entire business models around government spend. And so both sides are demanding, both sides of this spectrum are demanding and shouting for more spending, no matter what, don't cut my spending. And it's those in the middle that continue to feel the squeeze. And that's why it's average middle income working age families who are leaving because they just can't afford it anymore.
Yeah, but it's all relative, Michael. I mean, Barbara may be right, or I'm not sure I agree fully with what she said, but she may be right. But it's all relative. We got a $1.5 billion deficit. The governor tried to close that. The governor in 2019 tried to close whatever the deficit was at that time through cuts. Didn't happen. Not going to happen. He hasn't tried it again. No appetite in the legislature to support those level of cuts. We got to deal with that $1.5 billion deficit. So the question is, what's the best way? I mean, there's no perfect answer. There's no painless answer. But what's the best way to deal with it? So it's all relative. And so that PFD cuts are the worst for middle and lower income Alaska families, worst for middle income Alaska families of all the alternatives. You know that sales taxes aren't perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better than PFD cuts. You know that a progressive income tax of the type proposed by Elise Galvin is just a thin veneer on top of deep PFD cuts. So it's worse for middle income Alaska families. You've got to focus on the relativity, the relative impacts of these various bills. None of them are going to be painless. None of them are going to be painless because we had a $1.5 billion deficit that there's no appetite to close through cuts, through spending cuts. So none of the solutions are going to be painless. It's the relativity of those solutions, and finding the one that's best for middle income Alaska families is the best outcome for the state. I mean, if it's best for middle income families, it's going to be best for lower income Alaska families also. I mean, that's just the way the economics of it work. So you got to find the one that takes the least out of middle income Alaska families, and it's a relative calculation. What Elise Galvin's trying to do is trying to blow smoke at people and saying, "Oh, I'm only going to tax the rich," and so I'm the best, clearly, because I'm the best for middle income families because I'm only going to tax the rich. Well, no, you're not. You're only raising 20% of the deficit. You got to close the remainder of the deficit. And what's your way to close the remainder of the deficit? PFD cuts. And when you layer on PFD cuts to this thin veneer you've got of income tax, what's the effect? Certainly worse than PFD cuts overall, and worse than a sales tax. I mean, so you've got to do the full economics. You got to do the full analysis on all of this stuff, and then it's all relative. You got to figure out which is the best or which is the worst, depending upon what your starting point is among the relative options.
It's frustrating again to watch all this go on, especially when we know that this problem doesn't get any better. Right, Brad? I mean, we've seen the projections. We know what the 10-year forecasts look like. It just doesn't get any better. And we're about to have an election year, and all of these yahoos are going to be running for re-election. And again, a lot of these people were there that helped you create the problem, right? And now they're supposedly going to solve it, and they're going to tell you in their election campaigns that, oh, I'm the guy to solve all this issue. But they won't even address it right now when it's time to when the rubber's going to meet the road.
Yeah, they're I mean, in addition to unserious legislators, we have unserious candidates who are talking about solutions, going back to Governor Dunleavy's 2018 pledge of I'm going to cut our way out of this problem. Well, no, you're not. We know you're not. We know the legislature won't go along with that. You may try, but it's not going to happen. We need to look for serious candidates who are talking about full solutions, not like Elise Galvin with a 30% only approaching 20% of the problem. We need to look for candidates who are talking about full solutions, and full solutions involve some revenues, and they need to be talking about what the least harmful revenue approach is.
Well, full revenues and oil industry, tax changes, right. Solidifying the PFD, cutting some government. I mean, there's the solution is all encompassing, just like we've been talking about. Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, is our guest. The weekly top three continues on to the final of this week's top three, number three. And the question is, how much do some of the legislators hate the PFD? Well, I mean, let me preface what Brad is about to say with, we just watched that Commonwealth North presentation with Giesel and former Senator von Imhoff, and I would argue that they are basically saying the quiet part out loud that a lot of legislators are saying, which was basically, look at all the things we could spend this $685 million on that we wasted on the PFD. Look at all these things that we could spend on the Medicaid, the Medicare, the tourism, the homelessness, the policing, just fill in the blank, all the things that they could spend. Boy, there's a lot of them that just hate that money leaving their fingertips, Brad.
One of the things that the most recent ICER analysis does that's different from the 2016 ICER analysis is it looks in detail and with some new tools and using some new approaches, looks at the level of contribution that would come from non-residents under various revenue approaches. The old ICER analysis, the 2016 ICER analysis, sort of looked at that briefly and found that there wasn't much difference, frankly, in the level that Alaskans would pay, the share that Alaskans would pay under any of the various revenue options. They would pay the most under PFD cuts, but only slightly more than they would pay under sales taxes or income taxes or any of the other approaches. The burden on Alaskans didn't shift much between the various revenue options. The 2026 study takes a much deeper look at that and comes to much different conclusions, and concludes that there would be a significant difference on Alaskans on the share of the overall revenue burden that Alaskans share or bear under various alternatives. So, for example, under PFD cuts, Alaskans bear 86%, using PFD cuts, Alaskans bear 86% of the cost of any revenue raised through PFD cuts. The remainder of it is borne by reduced federal income taxes. But Alaskans would bear 86% of the cost of any dollar revenue raised through PFD cuts. But then they go through an array of other options, and they get down to two options where Alaskans only bear 68 or in one and 70%, significantly less than the share of the cost that Alaskans are bearing under PFD cuts. One is seasonal sales tax, which will shift a bunch of the costs to tourists that come in the summer, with more exclusions. That is, more exclusions for groceries and food and healthcare and those sorts of things. That would reduce the share of costs that Alaskans bear down to 68% compared to the 86% that they bear under PFD cuts. And an income tax, a flat income tax with a PFD credit, that is, you're able to use your PFD as payment toward the flat income tax that would be owed under the state. That reduces the share of the burden that Alaskans would bear raising a dollar of revenue down to 70% compared to the 83 or the 86% that we're bearing for PFD costs. It would reduce Alaskans' share of the burden down to 70%. Someone else would bear 30% of the burden of raising that dollar of revenue using that approach. So there are huge differences, significant differences in the impact on Alaskans in terms of the dollars taken from Alaskans' pockets compared to non-Alaskans, and in terms of the impact on the overall economy in terms of the share that's being taken out of Alaskans' pockets and taken as opposed to being taken out of others' pockets. There's huge differences in the various alternatives. I wrote a column on that. My Friday column last week ended up being on that because I'd gotten a lot of comments about the fact that using the old ICER analysis that there wasn't that much difference. I got a lot of comments about that, so I wrote last Friday's column on an analysis of that issue. How much Alaskans are able to reduce the impact of on them of a revenue approach by these various alternatives. I have a couple of trolls that show up regularly, weekly, on my column in the comments section on my column, complaining about this, that, or the other thing. I'm confident that if I said the sky was blue or the sun was yellow, that these trolls would write negative comments about that. But what really shocked me was the comments that I got on this column that said, "Oh no, we can't have we've got to use PFD cuts because that's the fairest way, regardless of what the impact is on Alaska families, regardless of what the impact is on the Alaska economy. That PFD cuts is the only fair way to raise revenue. That we've got to cut the PFD, even though Alaskans, the overall Alaska economy would be better off by shoving a bunch of the burden to others, to non-residents and others, even though Alaska would be hugely better off using one of those other alternatives, and Alaska families would be hugely better off because it would lower the take from Alaska families by using one of these other methods to raise revenues. Even though Alaskans would be better off, they still argued that it had to be done through PFD cuts for various reasons. Oh, it's free money, and we got to take free money out of people's pockets first. So we've got people out there in the state who hate PFDs so much that they overlook alternatives that are better for the overall Alaska, hugely better, 20% better, hugely better for the overall Alaska economy and Alaska families. They look past those alternatives because we've got to do it through PFD cuts. It is self-defeating. It is it inflicting a wound on the Alaska economy at a time that we really can't afford it. It's inflicting a wound on Alaska families, all Alaska families, because even the upper income Alaska families would benefit from offloading a significant share of the burden to non-residents, and others would benefit from reducing the burden on the Alaska economy and on Alaska families. Even upper income residents would benefit from that. But oh no, we can't have any of that. We can't reduce the burden on Alaskans because we've got to cut PFD cuts first, no matter what. And it's just the hatred for the PFD is just so all-consuming for some people that it's shocking to me. I mean, the starting point for me for any analysis ought to be what's best for Alaska families and what's best for the overall Alaska economy, period. Let's figure out what the best option is for those two, and let's build on that. These guys, others, start from the option of, oh no, we can't have PFDs. We got to take that free money first, and then maybe we'll look at other things. But we got to take that free money first.
Well, and how much of that, Brad, is due to the fact that, again, we're completely disconnected. The economies, the public and the private economies, are completely disconnected, so that they don't care. And secondly, they don't want to upset the apple cart because right now they're getting all that free money pretty easily. And if they did turn to something like this seasonal sales tax or something else, people might start paying attention to what's going on in the size and scope of government, and they don't want that level of scrutiny. That's why they hate the PFD. It's not necessarily because they hate it per se. It's because it's their money. They get a chance to spend it. Alaskans have kind of capitulated on it, so there's really no pushback. But if they did something else, people might start paying attention.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, Michael. But I think it's also we've got this mantra about free money has become so ingrained in some people that they're just going to do anything to wipe out that free money. We got to take the free money first. What they don't understand, or if they do, they choose to ignore it, is that upper income Alaska families, oil companies, non-residents are benefiting from free money also. If we didn't have the share of the permanent fund earnings that's being diverted to covering the cost of government, we'd have taxes for that share of the cost of government. So this free money, they're benefiting from the free money also. What right. Hammond did with the PFD was say 50% of that, 50% to the people in terms of permanent fund dividend. They just want more and more of the free money for themselves by cutting PFDs and converting it over to using it as this tax shield for taxes that they would otherwise pay. It is what amazes me about this is people don't focus on the impact on the overall Alaska economy of what the revenue raising measure is that we're using. They don't focus on the impact on Alaska families. They don't focus on the impact on middle income Alaska families and say, look, let's do what's best for Alaska families. Let's do what's best for the Alaska economy. Start from that premise. They start from a different premise, which is let's take away that free money first.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you make a valid point when you're arguing that they are benefiting from that free money. The upper and lower incomes are benefiting because they're reaping the benefit of government spend without having come out of their pocket for it. And I think that's a good way to look at it as well. Barbara, I think she synopsizes what we were just saying there. She said the PFD ensures the money is distributed based on population and not the political clout of particular politicians. Politicians who seek to end the PFD are seeking to pork barrel money for their district or industry or for their donator class. That's I would add that to the end of that, but I think that's pretty close, Brad.
Yeah, that's certainly the motivation of a lot of legislators and others, which is to, I mean, Scott Kendall expresses this every once in a while. We've got to use the PFD because otherwise we wouldn't be able to. We've got to use PFD cuts to fund government because otherwise we wouldn't be able to raise enough money. If we had to use taxes, other forms of taxes, we wouldn't be able to raise enough money to fund the government, all this government stuff, spending that we want to do. So we got to use PFD cuts because that largely affects only middle and lower income Alaska families. They don't have a significant voice in the process, and we can just keep taking money from them, as opposed to these other revenue measures where we would have to take money from upper income and from oil companies and from others as well who might push back on the spending. I mean, that is the motivation of many of them. But you know, the thing that just shocks me is people who ought to be concerned most about the overall Alaska economy, about how much money Alaska is keeping inside the state and keeping in the pockets of Alaska families, and those who ought to be concerned about the impact of these revenue measures on Alaska families. Those who ought to be, that's the core thing that we ought to be concerned about. Not how much government is spending, or not how much how silently or how stealthily you can get money over to government. We ought to be concerned about the impact on the overall Alaska economy and Alaska families. People who ought to be concerned about that aren't. They say they are, but when push comes to shove, when you have the numbers in front of you that show that all these alternatives are better than using PFD cuts, they just ignore it and wish it away.
And again, because it's the easy road. It's the easy road. It's the easy money, and they don't want to rock the boat. And again, they don't want people to be activated. And if there was some other form of taxation that caused people to have more skin in the game, they might start paying attention to what the size and scope of government is, and they might be a little upset about it. And they definitely don't want to rock the boat in that regard.
Yep. It's easiest for them to take it this way. I agree with that. But you know, we're just starting at the wrong end. We're starting at the wrong end of the analysis. Starting point for the analysis, Oz, it should be what's best for Alaska families and what's best for the overall Alaska economy, and let's go from there.
But Brad, that's presupposing that they care about what's going on in the private economy, right? As long as the government economy is protected and that's the thing. You're right. 100% I agree. But all those yahoos out there, they don't really care what happens in the private economy because there's no benefit to them on it because there's no revenue base on it from them. So it could wither and die as long as the service economy is there to provide services to the government. It's all good.
Yeah, well, that's a prescription for death of a state. I mean, we're seeing it in the outmigration of the middle income brackets. Yeah, we're seeing the income, the effect of not caring about their economics, other than what can government spend on it? What more can we spend to, make those people stay? We're seeing the effect of it. People leave. People vote with their feet. They leave. Yeah. They don't come. We end up with 26% of the workforce coming from outside, as opposed to being able to fill it with people in the state.
What are you watching this next week, Brad? What are you going to be paying attention to this week here?
Oh, I'm going to be interested with what Senate Finance does with the Senate Resources referral of the oil tax bill, or what's now become the oil tax bill? Are they going to take it seriously? Are they going to do the hard work, or are they just going to blow it off? Will Wielechowski have essentially killed it by the huge overreach that Senate Resources made, and Senate Finance, and not doing the work that Senate Resources should have done? Will Senate Finance blow that off? And then, we're starting to get into the decisions that House Finance is going to make on the level of spending in the operating budget and various other things. So that'll be just the next step in the process, is going to be what I'm going to be interested in.
All right, Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. That does it for us today. You can find him at ak4sb.com, or his weekly column every week in the Alaska Landmine. I'll post that article up from last Friday again, so you can go back and look at the ICER analysis on that for yourself. All right, Brad, thanks so much for coming on board. Appreciate you, my friend. Thank you.
Michael, as always, thanks for having me. Well, that's a wrap for another week's edition of the weekly top 3 from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Thank you again for joining us. Remember that you can find past episodes on our YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, and keep track of us during the week on Facebook and Twitter. This has been Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. We look forward to you joining us again next week for another edition of the weekly top 3.